We will proceed shortly to our first speaker tackling a specific topic within the cybersecurity landscape. Our first speaker is Professor V.S. Subrahmanian of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Maryland. He is the Director of the Center for Digital International Government and the Director of the Lab for Computational Cultural Dynamics at the University of Maryland. He will discuss the global trends in creating cyber-resilient infrastructure, explaining the role of big data analytics in cybersecurity. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor V.S. Subrahmanian.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So it's a great pleasure to be back in Bombay, a city where I spent many, many years of my childhood. Let me start by saying that I'm going to be talking about three aspects. Oops, minor technical issue, but I'm going to talk about three things today. First, I'm going to talk about the weakest link, or one of the weakest links in computer security, which is the human. Whether you are a computer scientist or whether you're just a casual user of a computer for professional reasons, humans happen to be one of the weak links in computers. Okay, great. Second, so I'm going to look at the following questions today. Can we quantify what it is about human behavior that makes your computer vulnerable? Second, can I quantify somehow how vulnerable countries are? And three, can we put out forecasts on how malware, new types of viruses, new types of Trojans will spread through a network? And I want to do all this on the basis of real objective data, not speculation, but hard, cold facts. I'm at the Bombay Stock Exchange working with financiers who are used to dealing with spreadsheets, so you understand the value of data. I'm going to talk about data which we gathered from Symantec, one of the major antivirus companies. They gave us access to 2 years of data, unfortunately from a few years back. But nonetheless, this gives us a lot of information. And I'll talk more about this data as we move forward. I'll skip forward. I'm going to start, as I said, with three parts: a human vulnerability study, a study of the vulnerability of countries, and a study looking at how we can forecast the extent of spread of malware through a country. So all these studies involve fairly significant amounts of data. The country vulnerability study looks at 44 countries, pretty much all the OECD countries and the major developing economies. The country forecast study looks at 40 of those 44 countries, and this is still, the last one is pretty much still an ongoing piece of work. I'll start with the data set for our human vulnerability study. We didn't think we needed to look at 2 years of data for it, so we looked at 8 months of data with no sampling. Symantec, as you know, puts out Norton antivirus. How many of you here use Norton antivirus? Okay, quite a few people. And how many of you use some kind of antivirus product on your computers, even if it's not Norton? Okay, great. So most antiviruses, when you install them on your machine, not only block attacks on your machine, but they also monitor what you're doing on it. If you opt in, when you install Norton antivirus, it will collect data and send it back to their servers in order to improve their machines, their processes. The data we looked at over these 8 months included 3.7 million machines around the world, and over 13 billion malware reports generated from these 3.7 million machines. We excluded machines for which there was less than 200 days of data, and part of the reason we did that is because there were plenty of machines where people would get Symantec with the computer they bought, and then they would drop it after a few months when the initial free period expired. So at the end of the day, this particular study looks at a little over 1.5 million machines and 13 billion malware reports. What does the data we looked at look like? We looked at two data sets. One looked at what is called binary reputation data. So when you install a piece of code on your machine, that executable file is called a binary, zeros and ones, or object code. Binaries are downloaded onto your computer all the time, either intentionally by you or by other processes that you've installed on your machine. So what Symantec does in their Norton antivirus product is to look at what binaries are running on your machine. They've got to look at the binaries in order to figure out if these are malware or not, malicious or not. For each binary, whether it's malicious or benign, they gather certain data in our data set. And there's also something called antivirus telemetry. These are binaries, information about specific pieces of malicious code that have been detected. In this case, they'll tell you when they detected it, the manner of detection, et cetera, et cetera. The type of threat, is it a virus, is it a Trojan, is it a worm, is it something else? Oops. Thank you. So we looked at multiple hypotheses, and we said, can we link? We classified all users of these machines into 5 categories: gamers, professionals, software developers, and other. A single user, a single machine, could actually be classified into more than one category. So for example, all of us have families. We have kids who might use our computers. And the kids might be playing games while we're using it for some other purpose. So the same machine could end up being classified both as a gaming machine and as, say, a professional machine. The way we classify machines into categories is by looking at what software is running on it. If there's, for example, a lot of financial software running on it, we might classify it as a professional machine. If there's a lot of gaming software running on it, we might classify it as a gaming machine, or both. We then looked at the nature of the binaries on these machines and said, what are people doing on these machines? You know, we're looking at, in this study, 1.6 million machines. I have no way of grabbing those 1.6 million people and asking them questions. So we said, what is a proxy for their behavior? It's what's on their machine and what has been done with it. Can I look at that as a proxy for the behavior of these users and say something about the link between vulnerabilities on these machines and what they may be doing with those machines? And we looked at a number of things. The number of binaries, how much software is running on it. Are they loading crap? Sorry, not a technical word, but is there all kinds of junk on their machine? Are they loading, oops, unsigned binaries? So binaries by reputable software developers like Microsoft, major software development houses, are signed. That means that somebody is certifying to the benignness of this software. Somebody's putting their reputation and word behind it. How many of these are signed? What about low-frequency binaries? Binaries that we don't see very often. These could be a risk, but maybe not. What about user travel history? As people, some of you may be connecting to the internet here today, perhaps, or at your hotels. That's an example of travel where you're connecting to a different internet service provider. If you travel a lot, you're connecting to a lot of ISPs. And when are you logging in? And this can be normalized by the location of the machine as well. Night, day, or evening. We looked at all these things. And we said, well, and we looked at software developers that signed at least 100,000 binaries in our data set. We had 902 of them in all. And as I said, this is what we found. Anything with a check mark says we found something statistically significant between the behavior as captured by the number of binaries people have put on their machines, the number of low-frequency binaries they put on their machines, et cetera, and their vulnerability to attack. I'll give you lots of graphs on this in a few minutes. If I further say I'm not interested in looking individually at these, oops, all right. I thought I had an identical clicker, but apparently not. Its behavior is a little different. So if I look at the binaries, okay, if I look at the variables one by one and compare them with the number of attacks on machines on average in the category I'm looking at. So for example, when looking at gaming machines, what is the average number of attacks on those machines? When I look at gaming machines, what percentage of them are compromised? If I look at those factors individually, then I see the results that are shown on this chart. Everything looks significant. But if I build a model that actually tries to capture this all in one, in other words, I consider all of these not one at a time, but together, I see a slightly different picture. Okay? What I see as the most significant factors are the number of downloaded binaries. Anything with 3 stars is very, very significant. Anything with 1 star is less so. Downloaded binaries, very important. The percentage of binaries on your machine that are downloaded. The low-frequency binaries, the percentage of binaries on your machine that are relatively rare. In other words, is this binary occurring a lot? Are lots of people using it? If so, it's not rare. But if it's relatively rare, that's another factor. Not surprisingly, high-frequency binaries are inversely correlated with threat as well. Okay, so this is a trick question, which is I'm showing you 5 lines on this chart in different colors. Each of those lines, the x-axis shows you, the y-axis shows you the average number of attacks. The x-axis shows you the number of binaries captured by decile. So in other words, if I have a machine, the 2 here, over here at the bottom here, says look at everybody in the bottom 20% in terms of the number of binaries that they have. 44 says look at people in the bottom 40% in terms of the number of binaries they have. In other words, 60% of the people have more than them. These are 5 different charts. The y-axis shows the average number of attacks on those kinds of machines. Each colored line on this corresponds to one of the 5 categories listed here. Users in the study, which is everybody who's using those 1.6 million machines. Machines that are classified as gamers, machines that are classified as software developers, machines that are classified as professionals, which includes financial specialists, doctors, lawyers, etc., as well as a category which is what we call other, when we couldn't fit them into one of the other categories. Of course, everybody fits into all. So a quick question. Obviously, the category of users who are most heavily affected is the blue line. Second most heavily affected or most vulnerable is the red line. Who do you think they are? Anybody want to take some guesses? Sorry? Gamers? Sorry? Software developers? All? Okay, there are only 2 more guesses you can take. So I'll go ahead and give you the answer. So, okay. Interestingly, the most vulnerable to attack were software developers. So whoever said software developers somewhere in that part of the room, please give yourself a pat on the back. Software developers are the most vulnerable of the lot. And I'll hypothesize why later, okay? Gamers are up there too. They're the red line. The green line are the professionals. And interestingly, the other category are actually the least vulnerable. They have the fewest number of attacks on their machines that are going on. By the way, I do want to emphasize one thing. As all these machines were protected by Norton antivirus, they were eventually deflected, okay? The attacks. Again, this chart here on the left, don't worry if you can't read exactly what the chart says, but just look at the different colors and the trend of the line. What you see, again, is as the number of low-frequency binaries in the leftmost chart, as the number of low-frequency binaries goes up, you are seeing an increased number of attacks per machine. By the way, I want to mention that we also looked at, on the y-axis, not the number of attacks on average in that category of machine, but also the percentage of machines that were attacked belonging to that category. The trend is the same in both cases. I'm not showing the second set of charts. As you would expect, if you primarily tend, the middle chart, if you primarily tend to use high-frequency binaries, these are things that lots of people use. So you would expect products like Adobe Acrobat. You would expect products like Microsoft Outlook to be in the category of low-frequency binaries. I'm sorry, high-frequency binaries. Then you do pretty well. As the percentage of binaries on your machine tend to be more high-frequency, you're actually safer. I'll skip some of these. Again, number of downloaded binaries versus number of infections, the same trend. So I'm usually afraid to give this talk at computer science conferences because the software developers get very upset. But hopefully there aren't too many of you here. So I'm going to move from the... So what I've just told you so far says a little bit about how human behavior on these machines is correlated to an increased amount of vulnerability. And by the way, all this is statistically valid. I've not gone over the statistical numbers, but everything is statistically valid. Okay, take it from me. All right. Let's look at countries. So we said, can we look at countries in our data? This time we use the entire 2 years of data, 2010, 2011. Technically, the period started just before 2010 and ended towards the end of 2011. Okay, so, but I'm going to call it 2010 and 2011 data. There were a little over 4 million machines in our study in each of the 2 years. There was, of course, an overlap between the machines, between the first year and the second year, but in all, there were a little over 4 million machines in both those years. We removed all hosts with less than 100 days of data, and we looked at all countries for which we had at least 500 hosts reporting in each of these years. What I can say is that in 2011, every country we looked at, every one of the 44 countries had at least 1,000 hosts represented in our data. And in 2010, all but 3 or 4 of them had 1,000 hosts. But everyone had more than 500. As I said before, we look at 2 things: the number of infections per machine in a country and the percentage of machines in that country that are infected. And the 44 countries we're looking at include all the major developing economies, all the major developed economies, the countries you would think of as big players. So, question: which 5 countries do you believe are the most vulnerable in terms of the number of attacks on average per machine in their country? Sorry? USA? China? India? UK? South Korea? Russia? Wow, I'm quite impressed. Okay. So here's the bad news. As I'm sitting in India, India is the most vulnerable, according to both measures, but that is in one of the 2 years. In the other year, it was South Korea, okay? So you have a fairly well-developed OECD economy in South Korea, which is getting hammered. According to both measures, both the percentage of machines that have been attacked and the average number of attacks per machine. According to both measures, India and South Korea claim the top or bottom spot, as you wish to look at it. But they're the most vulnerable. I also heard from the audience China, Russia, and I didn't hear South Africa and Malaysia, but they're all up there. The US, which I did hear, and the UK are both more or less at number 12 in terms of being number 12, plus I forget exactly the rank, but around 12, in both years, both measures, in terms of being the safest. One reason you might hear the US in other studies being called the most vulnerable is because they only count the number of hosts in the country, not the percentage of infected hosts. As the US has a lot more hosts than many countries, they would win by that measure in terms of vulnerability. But in fact, they're not. What about the lowest rate of attacks? Who's, of the 44 economies, including all the big ones, who do you think is the safest? We know it's not the US and UK because I just told you they're number 12. approximately. We know it's not the other 5 countries I just listed. Israel, Japan, Switzerland, sorry, Australia. Any other takers? Germany, Singapore. Okay, I don't remember if Singapore was in our study, okay? I'll have to go back and look. Okay, so the Scandinavian countries, hands down, come in as being the safest. So that's, depending on the year I looked at and the measure I looked at, it was Denmark, Sweden, and Norway trading off for being the safest. Okay, but they're all up there. Whichever measure you use, whichever year you look at, they're up there. Switzerland, somebody mentioned Switzerland. I think it was you, Nehal. Very safe. Japan, Germany is sort of hanging out there just outside the top 6. Japan is looking very good as well. Just also out of the top 6. With some slightly different measures, I could put Japan in the top 5. They're up there, looking pretty good. One very interesting thing about Japan, I've got to figure out in the next month exactly what they did during this time frame is from 2010 to 2011, they made huge progress in going from being unsafe to safe. They jumped up about 10 spots. And I don't know if that was just an accident or it happened to be a concerted effort. So that's something I've got to look at. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. Let me, so this is sort of a very quick picture of what the world looks like. Somebody said Australia, they're also out there with the US and the UK around number 11, 12. Somebody said Israel, they're a little lower down actually, closer to numbers 17 to 20 in terms of being the safest. By the way, I should mention one thing, which I should have mentioned earlier. This is data that Symantec gave us that they collected from consumer machines. That means ordinary mortals like you and me, not enterprises, or likewise not governments. It could very well be that governments, enterprises have a different profile. But they won't give us that data. So, and I can't really complain. They gave us a lot. But you know, no computer scientist is happy unless he gets all the data he wants. Okay, this is again a map of Europe. Okay, let's look at something slightly different. Across the board, across all countries, what is the average number of attacks per machine? So what you see on the x-axis here is the number of attacks, and what you see on the y-axis is the percentage of hosts that have that many attacks or less. So if I look at the number, you may not be able to read the x-axis very well here. This is 0 here, this is 50 here, 100, and so forth, okay? So what you see is that around 50, this curve levels off, okay? But what you may not see easily is that this number on the y-axis at the bottom of this graph is 0.5. That is very good news, okay? Because what it says is that about half the hosts that we looked at in our sample were not infected by a single piece of malware, which was much better news than we had expected when we started the study. However, as I'm in India, I thought I'd just put up a couple of charts about India. The situation in India is a little different. The number, the blue line shows India, and what you see is that when x is 0, then that is the number of, only the person, that is, when x is 0 means these are the number of machines that have 0 attacks on them. The percentage of machines with 0 attacks on them from India is 20%, compared to the global average of 50. Okay? So, again, as I said, I have not interviewed the 4.3 million people or even a sample of them to see why. And in any case, the data was anonymized by Symantec before they would let me touch it. So I can't say why this behavior is occurring, but we can always speculate about what it might be. But I'll try not to do that. So again, you're seeing, well, India needs to beef up things a little bit. If I plot on the x-axis the percentage of attacked hosts, and on the y-axis the average number of infections per host or machine, what you see, not surprisingly actually, is an increasing trend. So, and each of the dots that you see represents a country. I haven't tried to list every single country here, but you see the curve. It's clearly globally a problem. This is a very interesting and bizarre phenomenon, which shows you graphs, and it shows you how attacks on countries varied by month. And I don't know why we plotted this graph, but I was intrigued by the result that came out, okay? And the result that came out was really about South Korea. So to me, when I found out, I had not expected to see South Korea tying India, more or less, for the bottom spot. India, China, Russia, as many of you guessed, it's not a big surprise. South Korea was a surprise to me. And when we looked at this graph, we noticed that in the December to May timeframe, during that winter timeframe, in both years, South Korea, sorry, not South Africa, South Korea experienced a huge number of attacks. I was talking to some friends in Israel about this some months ago, and one of the cybersecurity people there said, well, yes, this is pretty simple. It's because of North Korean cyber attacks on South Korea. That sounds plausible, but at this point, I want to sort of just inject a word of caution about attribution. I had no data available to me that allowed me to infer where the attacks were coming from, number one. Second, I've seen plenty of work on attribution of attacks, including, for example, the recent attacks on Sony, which were attributed to North Korea. I can't say whether that's right or wrong, but I do want to say that many of the techniques that are used to attribute attacks are very dicey at best and very suspect. To give you an example, one of the classical techniques used to attribute large-scale attacks is analysis of the source code. So a good example is the Regan piece of malware that hit India and Saudi Arabia towards the end of last year. Actually, it had been present for much longer than that. It was reported by Kaspersky Lab, which we heard about from someone earlier, in November last year. This is a piece of malware that was attributed to the British government because of the existence of certain cricket terms used in the source code. In particular, there were certain subroutines called leg spin, okay, and various other terms. But you know, if I was some other country and first let me start with a disclaimer. I don't know if the Brits did it or not. I did not have access to the source code. But you can imagine that if you're a nation state carrying out such a cyber attack, it's very easy to get your coders to write whatever they want so that it works, and then have somebody scrub the code so it points the finger at someone else. It doesn't take a lot of rocket science to realize there are only a few countries that play cricket, and that of those countries, only a few are likely to target India and Saudi Arabia, and those would be the obvious suspects if you could blame. But of course, we all know that there are other countries also that may want to gather intelligence on India and Saudi Arabia, not just the Brits. So it's very easy for whoever created and unleashed such malware to set up source code that points the finger at somebody else, okay? Now, there may be other information that allowed whoever concluded and attributed this attack outside the cyber domain that told them who was culpable, but I don't have access to that. Let me, okay. This is again very interesting. If I plot per capita GDP on the x-axis and the average number of attacks per host on the y-axis, you see a decreasing trend. Rich countries get attacked less, simply put. There are a few exceptions to this. South Korea is a notable outlier, sitting all the way at the top, way away from the curve. Norway, with a very high GDP, is all the way at the end, very low number of attacks. Let me throw out a question for all of you. So, how many of you, when you've used your computers, have seen pop-ups telling you to sign up for antivirus software? Lots of people. What about disk cleanup utilities? Again, lots of people. Okay, don't click on those, okay? Most of them inject some kind of malware into your computer. These may range from keyboard loggers, just as an example, to spyware of other sort. Something very interesting. We looked at the number, if I just look at spyware. So this chart shows only spyware. And it says on the x-axis there's GDP, on the y-axis it is the percentage of attacks that are spyware attacks on those machines. I'm sorry, let me say that again. The average number of spyware attacks per machine. What you see is a decreasing trend, which tells you that countries with relatively low GDPs are hit much harder by spyware. That means, from the perspective of everybody in this room, and India in general, with a somewhat lower GDP towards the left side of the x-axis here, you need to worry about spyware, okay? Keyboard loggers, things like that. That doesn't mean you don't worry about the rest. But if I go to the next chart, with respect to what's called misleading software, that is fake antivirus packages being offered to you, disk cleanup utilities, things that claim they'll increase memory usage, blah, blah, blah. There, the trend is the opposite. Rich countries seem to be more heavily targeted. As GDP increases on the x-axis, you see an increasing trend, by and large. So rich countries tend to be hit more aggressively with things like that. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm going to take another 7-8 minutes, hopefully that's okay, to say a little bit about ongoing work we have on forecasting how malware will spread. I would have liked to say forecasting how malware would spread through a network, but I didn't have network data for the machines in our sample. So we decided instead to forecast how malware will spread through a country. Now, let's think a little bit about this problem. Clearly, how malware spreads through your enterprise or through a country, or in general through a set of machines, depends not only on the malware, but it also depends on the defensive steps that have been taken by the people who own that host, right? So we built out a model that captured, we looked at the entire 2 years of data, but instead of looking at all the pieces of malware represented in our 2 years, we only looked at the top 50, okay? The 50 most common malware that we saw in those 2 years of data. And we looked at let me rephrase that. We are looking at 40 countries. We finished about 10 of them so far. But and we hope to finish the whole study by the end of May. But I'm going to report on results today for 5 countries that I thought would be somewhat popular. India, we're here, the most popular country here today. China, South Korea, UK, and US. And we tried an 80-20 forecast, which means I use 80% of my data for training, 20% for testing. But let me say one more thing. Typically what we do is we don't just use 80-20 forecasts. We may train on 30% of the data and test on the remaining 70%. There's plenty of data here. I have 2 years of data. And we said, how well do countries do? So let me ask you the question. I'm just giving you 5 countries. And we're talking about the 50 most common malware. Which of these 5 countries do you think is most heavily affected or most heavily affected, okay? Who gets hit the most? India? Korea? China? Okay, there are only 2 other countries left. Okay, I think this is the same question. Okay, so the trend changes here. And the 2 countries I didn't hear mentioned are the ones who get hit the most by the 50 most common malware, okay? So the US is at the top of this list, the pink line that you see. So the x-axis is number of days out. The red line, vertical line here says we predicted out here. The pink line, all the way at the top of the graph, above every other line is the US line. The yellow line that you see, or sort of tan-colored line, is the UK. Okay? The green line is South Korea. India and China are at the bottom. So what this suggests is that the most common malware affects the most developed economies, at least in these 5, more than the less developed ones. Okay, again, I could not talk to system managers in these 5 countries asking them what they did. But it could also suggest some other things. Why is this happening? I'll come back to India in a minute. Oops. But it could be our model took into account patching behavior as well that was reported in our data when patches were applied. Let me sort of ask you 2 questions. One, clearly, a patch cannot be developed for an exploit before the exploit is detected. By exploit, I mean a piece of malware, okay? So before an exploit is detected, nobody knows about it, so they couldn't develop a fix or patch to it. On average, how long do you think a piece of malware exists in the wild before it's detected? Anybody want to take some guesses? Sorry? 2 years? Five years? Okay, so you're more pessimistic than the facts. But the facts are not very reassuring either. So on average, 312 days in the data we looked at. I've talked to others, and they've observed 250 to 400 days. So the 312 is right within that sweet spot. So that means that a piece of software is out there, an exploit, bad piece of code, is out there for almost a year before people figure out it's out there. And that means it's merrily doing whatever it wants. I mean, we're talking about risk and resilience here today. That's a big risk. The second thing I want to ask is the following. So let's say today, VirusTotal, which is a Google property now, announces that a new malware has been found and also announces a patch for it. Or NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US, which also owns a database called the National Vulnerability Database. Anybody can access it and download it, telling you also what are the vulnerabilities that are known in different pieces of software and what are the patches available for it, if any. How long do you think on average it takes to patch it? So all of you, some of you are CIOs, some of you are software professionals, some of you are senior leadership executives in your companies. How long do you think it takes on average for a vulnerability to be patched? Okay, nobody's taking a shot at this. 4 months. Okay, so that means if I am a bad guy, I don't even have to waste time developing an exploit. All right? I just wait and look at total virus and say, oh, a new vulnerability is announced today. Here's the vulnerability. I can go out and buy an exploit on the market for that vulnerability pretty easily for almost nothing. Then I have on average 4 months to attack any one of many enterprises. This is a fixable problem. The business about finding malware in the wild is a little harder. But patching something when the patch exists is certainly doable. So why, coming back to this question, we saw earlier when I looked across the board at all the malware in our 2-year data set, the US and UK were coming out looking pretty safe, around number 12, plus minus maybe 1 or 2 spots. But when we look at the 50 most common pieces of malware, they come out looking pretty bad, at least compared to India, China, and South Korea. Again, I don't know the answer, but my hypothesis would be that in the US, one hypothesis would be that in India, China, and South Korea, people are pretty diligent about patching the biggest vulnerabilities. But they stop there. In the US, with the same number of people, perhaps the effort is spread out more because there's a recognition that a smart attacker might not use the biggest vulnerability to compromise your system. He might use lesser known vulnerabilities that you probably have not patched against. And he gets right in the door, okay? So it's like saying, I've got a house with many doors, and I'm only going to spend my time securing the front door, the back door, and a couple of windows, but I'm leaving a whole bunch of windows unprotected. The bad guy comes straight through there. That, I think, is what's happening, but again, I can't be sure. Part of what I keep telling everybody is we should be making decisions on the basis of objective data and drawing inferences on the basis of objective data. That's why I'm trying to distinguish between places where I'm making a hypothetical statement that I cannot validate on the basis of data and cases where I am making a strong claim on the basis of data. Okay, so a couple of recommendations to Indian security managers. Everything should be patched fast. You guys need to have your security managers watching Total Virus. You guys need your security managers watching the National Vulnerability Database. Your programming security team should be looking at that every single day, or set up alerts to monitor it every single day, every single minute. As soon as a patch is available for a vulnerability, that patch must be applied. You cannot just patch the highest level, the most dangerous vulnerabilities. You've got to worry about vulnerabilities which are classified as being less dangerous as well. It's pretty simple. The front door might be the biggest vulnerability in your house, but if a bad guy gets in through the window, it's just as dangerous to you as if he got through the front door. You can't really be happy that he came through the window and not through the front door. Yeah. The second, everybody deploys the security systems that we know how to deploy. So people say, well, due diligence, I got to stick in all kinds of authentication, I've got to encrypt, I've got to have firewalls. Yes. You can't stop there. People are very reluctant to mention humans and users as being a big vulnerability in the system. We heard several times today about the Russian attack, cyber attack on the White House. What you may not have read is a very, very explicit statement somewhere that I read that said, well, the Russians have basically owned the State Department network for quite a long time. I have no idea, again, if that's true, but I have read it. It is true that I've read that. And furthermore, it said that this was through a spear phishing attack, which is a human-engineered attack. Now, today, let me ask a question. How many of you, when you get a LinkedIn request from somebody you don't know, actually accept it? Okay, nobody's willing to confess to doing that. Okay. I'm willing to bet that at least one person in this audience has done it at some point. Okay. It seems like a pretty safe bet to me. Well, that's social engineering. So what we're seeing today are very, very highly targeted attacks. I've gotten highly targeted email trying to get me to click on a PDF or click on a URL. Okay? And I know these emails are highly targeted because they come to me from somebody I know. They come to me with information that could be plausible, but there's just something a little bit off that makes me question it. And if I call the guy and say, hey, did he send this email? I've had at least 2 answers, which were no. Okay? And I'm not the only one who gets these. So there's a lot more, many more, much more important people than me who is actually worth compromising. I mean, if they compromise my machine, it doesn't matter so much. But if they compromise the machine of a minister or a leader of one of the companies in the Bombay Stock Exchange, it's a problem. We also heard about exfiltration of sensitive data. So we have a lot of great IT companies in India, and a lot of the data they hold is very, very sensitive data that they are managing very carefully for customers in India and overseas. You've got to worry about exfiltration of that data. It's not just outside attack, but insider threat that also has to be considered. It just needs 1 or 2 bad guys to walk away with a lot of your data. Customer lists, who might be a potential churn opportunity for a competitor, Those are all things you need to worry about. And of course, you can monitor what people are doing in a non-malicious but still risky way, like downloading lots of weird stuff. Recommendation to CEOs. Okay, the first one I think is pretty non-controversial. The second one may be a little more controversial. Clearly, you need to worry. If you're running a big corporation, a securities firm, you need to worry about at least 4 things before it happens. You've got to assume today that your systems are going to be compromised. There is no guarantee that they will not be compromised, and if you hold valuable financial data, you should expect to be compromised. That means right now, today, you need to know, 1, what are the legal, what are you going to do if you find out tomorrow that your company data has been compromised? You need your legal team in place. You need a game plan on how you're going to respond to the legal liabilities that you might face because of this. You need a technical team in place. Don't worry about finding out who did it. First, shut it down. Build a box around it to make sure you've contained the damage. 3, you don't want to be talking to the police and security staff when it happens. They're going to have no idea what's going on in your system. If you're running a big company, you're going to have complex systems. It's going to take them a while. Make sure you've got those connections in place well before the fact. Build that bridge. And 4, you better have your PR team ready. If you're a publicly traded company or you're a financial company holding investors' money or depositors' money, you can expect the press to be beating on your door. You better understand how you're going to deal with that. So I don't think anybody's going to have too many complaints about this part. But the second part, perhaps, is a little more controversial. And that is, you cannot protect your system. Your system or your company's enterprise is part of a much broader ecosystem. And a vulnerability, even outside your company's enterprise network, can affect you adversely. That means, I understand there are many reasons why companies do not want to say we got attacked. You know, the number of banks in Europe and the US that have had money ripped off through cyber attacks and don't want to talk about it is quite large. And the reason they don't want to talk about it, in part, is worries about liability. 2, worries about adverse publicity. 3, worries that it might encourage more criminal activity. Well, guess what? The criminals already know, okay? You're not going to encourage more criminal activity by disclosing that you've been attacked. So if you're attacked, or let me rephrase this, don't worry about you. Worry about your partners, your corporate partners. If your corporate partners are attacked, would you like to know about it? If your enterprise is affected, the answer is probably yes. But if you're not willing to reciprocate, they may not be willing to share information about attacks with you either. So if you're attacked, you need to share that both with law enforcement and with your corporate partners. And that also includes recommendations to governments. I don't know if there are still any government people here left, but certainly this morning we had the Honorable Governor of Maharashtra. Basic do's and don'ts of cybersecurity. You know, I didn't know this stuff, and I'm a computer science professor till several years back, okay? 10, 12 years back, you know, somebody sent me an email with a CV attached to it. No problem, I'd click it and look at their CV. People would send me CVs all the time. Now, I think about it before clicking on it. And so even if you're aware, you can be compromised, okay? I think I'm pretty aware of it now, but I wasn't 15 years back. I wasn't thinking about it. So basic do's and don'ts of cybersecurity should be taught at the school level, and likewise at the university level. But one of the very important things I want to mention is most academic cybersecurity programs don't prepare you to run an incident response team. So in other words, I should probably have put this on the previous slide. Oh, I did. Okay. You should have a cyber incident response team, or an IRT. If you don't have one, you better have one, if you're a large company anyway, or even a medium-sized company. specific training is needed to actually run an IRT. And that's something that needs to be put together. Again, there should be government policy that encourages and incentivizes companies who've been the victims of attacks to come forward with information that can be shared to protect the ecosystem as a whole. And moreover, when new reports of cyber attacks of different types are reported to a government, they need methods to predict who else is going to be affected. And take, so right now, in the US, what happens? There are attacks on banks, on some banks, and the FBI will put out this, some investigative agencies, not necessarily the FBI, will put out this blanket statement to all banks. This is a good way of actually messing things up. Because if there's no chance, if I'm a banker and there's no chance that this thing is going to hit me, it's a false alarm, which is wasting my time. And I tend to be desensitized then to subsequent alerts that actually might affect me. So we've got to have good prediction of who's likely to be hit next in such a chain. So with that, I'll stop. Again, I want to emphasize the work I'm reporting is work I've done with many people, my students, postdocs, and colleagues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor V.S. Subrahmanian, for your eye-opening talk. It was really interesting to learn from you about the global statistics around cybercrime and vulnerability. I'd now like to request Sri Nehal Vora, Chief Regulatory Officer, BSE, to present a memento to Mr. V.S. Subrahmanian, Director, Center for Digital International Government, University of Maryland. Thank you, Professor Subrahmanian and Mr. Nehal Vora.